Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this seminar this morning on the topic of getting to Africa's demographic dividend. We are very pleased to have you with us, but I would also like to welcome our online audience who will be joining us for the presentation and for the response afterwards. After our respondent, we will, however, say goodbye to the online audience, and then we will have an opportunity for some questions and comments. And I would then invite both the presenter, Dr. Silje, and our respondent, Professor Kadiagala, to participate in that part of the session. A brief introduction to our presenter and our respondent, although, of course, I'm sure most of you are familiar with them, but nevertheless, Yaki, who will be presenting today, is the chair of the ISS board and of trustees, and he's also head of the African Futures and Innovation Program here at the ISS. He furthermore has an affiliation to the faculties of law and humanities at the University of Pretoria. Professor Kadiagala is the Jan Smuts Professor of International Relations at the University of the Witwatersrand, and he's also currently serving as the acting chair of a new center there aimed at studying the United States from an African perspective, surely a first, Gilbert, in this country. I would like to also acknowledge the support from the donors, the funders for this project. Here specifically the Hans Seidel Foundation and SIDA. We are also very grateful to the members of the ISS Partnership Forum and to the governments of Australia, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Ireland, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the USA, who have been supporting this project ever since its inception a few years ago. Several of you would have participated or attended some of the previous reports, the so-called big picture reports that come out of this project. Some of the previous ones dealt with the impact of the fourth industrial revolution, progress towards meeting the SDG goals in Africa. Today's focus is very specifically on the whole issue of the continent's demographic dividend. I think what struck me most when I started reading this paper was to look at the median age of the world population, excluding sub-Saharan Africa, which is 34 years at the moment, whereas that of sub-Saharan Africa is only 19 years. And that suddenly made me realize that this is a very, very important topic for us to pay attention to. I'm therefore going to ask Yaki to start off immediately, 30 minutes for your presentation, after which I will turn to my colleague Gilbert and ask him for his response. Thank you, Yaki.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Chair. My apologies. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Yaki Silje. I'm the presenter this morning. I'm going to speak to you on getting to Africa's demographic dividend. I thought I'd start with providing you with a bit of a background on the work that the Institute does. This is a list of the areas of work done at the ISS. You'll see at the bottom it says long-term forecasting. That is the work that is done at the African Futures and Innovation Program at the Institute. We have done a series of country and regional long-term reports on the future of Ethiopia, Mozambique, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa. We are at the moment doing a study on the future of the 5 countries of the Sahel region. We have done a series of papers on the ability of Africa to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, such as on poverty, water, sanitation, health, etc. We have focused on various specific issues like future trends in violence, democracy, the future of development aid, urbanization, the fourth industrial revolution. And for all of this, we use the forecasting model, and we partner with the Frederick S. Pardee Center for International Futures at the University of Denver in Colorado, the United States. All the material we do is available free of charge on the ISS website, either under papers, reports, or books. For all our work, for most of our work, we use the International Futures Forecasting System, which is hosted and developed by the Frederick S. Pardee Center. IFS, as we refer to it, International Futures, allows you to look backward, where you have come from, to explore past trends. So it has data from 1960, and it forecasts until the end of the 21st century. So firstly, it allows you to understand how you have been able to get where you are. Where there is not data available, and it has more than 4,500 data sets in it, it interpolates, creates the data. It therefore allows you to understand how human social and environmental systems have developed over time, and then to shape the way in which the world could evolve. IFS has a current path forecast, which is a kind of a base case forecast or a business as usual forecast that we typically use as a kind of a reference scenario. Within its massive algorithms, IFS has 12 subsystems. I am obviously going to be using and referring a lot to the demographics module within IFS, but it also has an economics module, education, health, infrastructure, agriculture, energy, environment, technology, and the orange systems are natural systems, the blue systems are human systems, and then governance, finance, and international politics. What is unique about IFS is that all these systems are interconnected. So therefore, if you change the provision of water and sanitation to rural South Africans, it changes South Africa's GDP, it changes everything. It changes the world GDP, it changes. So this is the strength of IFS. It is open source and freely available. So the purpose of today's presentation is to explore the timing and conditions for African states achieving a demographic dividend that can accelerate the rate of improvements in livelihoods. The paper is available, copy of the paper, it is available outside, and there is also a video that is being launched today. The video will be on YouTube and on the ISS Africa TV by the end of the session. I want to speak about 4 issues. I want to explain what the demographic dividend is. I want to speak about the IFS current path, most likely forecast of where Africa and the world is likely to go. I'm going to explain to you the demographic dividend scenario that we modeled and the impact of that. And I'm going to conclude and show you a 3-minute video. Let's start off, and I often start my presentations with this slide. And it has a title that says that population growth in Africa constrains improvements in economic and social well-being. Africa currently has a population of about 1.3 billion people that will, by 2030, the time horizon of the Sustainable Development Goals, have increased by 32% to 1.7 billion. If one were to draw a graph, and I'm going to show you a few graphs, in this case I'm going to show you income. So on the left-hand side is thousands of 2011 US dollars. This is time from 1980 to 2030. This is what's happening with global incomes. So until about 2018, this is data, and that is a forecast. And this is what is happening with African average incomes. You can see the obvious divergence. This is where we are in 2018. You can see a growing divergence. And in actual fact, that growing divergence underpins almost all the work that we do at the African Futures and Innovation section at the Institute. Our question really is, what can we do to reverse this growing gap between average income levels in Africa and in the rest of the world? Because from 1994 to 2008, improvements in Africa's growth prospects were the longest in the continent's independent history. Yet by 2017, annual average incomes in Africa are only $460 per person on average, above their last peak in 1980. So 1980, average incomes had in actual fact peak, declined, and then we see this growth spurt. But look at the growing gap between Africa and the rest of the world. So this is not the world, this is the world without Africa. If we look at the forecast, this is the forecast. This is data. We can't really argue about the data. We can probably argue about the forecasts. Then from 2018 to 2030, our forecast is that Africa will on average grow at 4.8% by 2030. But that by 2030, 29% of Africans will still live in extreme poverty. 29% of Africa's total population. And I will show you the exact figure. It's over 400 million Africans. So poverty will largely have, by 2030, have become an African problem. It will have been largely eliminated elsewhere in the world, particularly in India, which still has a large poverty burden. But by 2030, when you speak about poverty, it's going to be about sub-Saharan Africa. My remarks come with two caveats, which I also just have to make once again. And the first is that demographic forecasts are inherently, we understand demographics better than almost any other system. And it is much easier to forecast, but still demographics is inherently also not, the future of demographics is not sure. So if on the left-hand side we have millions of people, and at the bottom we have years from 2018 till the end of the century, then this is the UNDP high population forecast. That is their low population forecast. That is their median population forecast. And look at this huge difference in the potential differences that there can be in population. Forecast, this is for the world. This is the IFS base case. This is the forecast that we use as a reference forecast. It's slightly below the median forecast of the UNDP in population. And the second really is just again to point to Africa's diversity and size, to remind us that I'm going to be generalizing about a continent that you can fit most of the rest of the world in terms of size. So we've got the US there, we've got China there, and so on. We can fit the entire rest of the world almost in the size of Africa. It is important to recognize how diverse and large this continent is, which I'm unashamedly going to now generalize about. And also point to the momentum in Africa's population growth. What this represents is simply 2015, 2030, 2045. This is Europe's population, which remains relatively stable at about 500 million people. And you can see that the momentum of Africa's very rapid population growth. So let me turn then to the first section of my presentation, which is explaining what the demographic dividend is. This is a standard population pyramid that many of you will know, where you have your population cohorts from children at the bottom to your working age population, 15 to 65, and your elderly above 65. It's a classical, normally when we present this, we would have women on the left and men on the right. And just to present how that pyramid changes over time. The demographic dividend is simply the relationship of your working age population to your dependents, elderly and the children. The more working age you have, the bigger a midriff you have, the better you will do. But the flatter your structure, the more dependent children you have, or the more elderly population you have, the more you will struggle. So this relationship between working age and dependence is very important. But you can define the demographic dividend in a number of ways. The first way is to say that the ratio of working age to dependence should be 1.2 person working age people to dependent or more. Then your economy grows. Or if this is less than 30% and that is less than 15%, you're also in a sweet spot. Another way to measure it is to say that if the median age of your population is between 25 and a half years and 41 years, you're in a demographic sweet spot. South Africa has just entered that demographic sweet spot. Or if your fertility rate is below 2.8 children per woman. So there are different ways of defining the demographic dividend, but it is basically all about the same thing, and that is how many working age people do you have to dependents. Now you will have heard that I'm not speaking of employment. I'm speaking of working age people. There's a big difference, because many people would first say, but there need to be work for these people that need to be educated and be in a good and have good health if they are to be able to work. But history tells us that a working age population creates the work and the environment and the educational opportunities. So it's not a one-way street. So there are different ways of defining the demographic dividend. These are 4 countries that are at different stages of the demographic dividend. On the top left, you have Niger, if I'm correct? Yes. Niger has got the youngest population structure in the world. Here we have Egypt. Egypt is just entering its demographic sweet spot. Median age is about 25 and a half years. Then we have Sweden. Sweden is just exiting its demographic sweet spot. Median age just over 41. Here we have Japan. Japan is the oldest population in the world. So you can see how the structure changes. So to show what median age, life expectancy, and total fertility rate would be for each of these, this is Niger. Median age in Niger is 15. Half of Niger's population is younger than 15. Other half is older than 15. The life expectancy in Niger is 63, and the total fertility rate, the number of children that the average woman has, is 7.2. Egypt, which has just entered its demographic dividend. This is all for 2018. Median age 25 years, a life expectancy 72, number of children 3.1, total fertility rate. This is Sweden, median age 41, life expectancy 83, total fertility rate 1.9, which tells you that Sweden's population is starting to shrink. If you go below about 2.1, populations start to shrink. This is Japan, median age 48, average life expectancy 84, and total fertility rate 1.5. In summary, Sub-Saharan Africa has too few people of working age and too large a population under 15 years of age to rapidly increase incomes. So Sub-Saharan Africa is very slowly going through its demographic transition. So this is a slide that shows total fertility rates for 54 of Africa's countries. These are the countries at the bottom. I know you can't read that, but on the left-hand side is the fertility rate. That would be Niger. This is Mauritius. This is your total fertility rate that starts for the start of the demographic dividend, and if it goes below 2.1, your population starts to shrink. So what you want is you want your fertility rate, in actual fact, to be between these two. If you have that, then your population slowly increases, and you have a nice midriff and your country is doing well, you're comfortable. Why is this important? Because the ratio of working age people to dependents alone explains 1/3 to half of long-term economic growth. That's simple fact. It's hugely important. You can determine if a country grows or not simply by looking at the ratio of working age people to dependents. That explains 1/3 to 1/2 of total economic growth. Amazing. Let me prove this. This is a graph that looks at the working age population relative to its elderly and children, to its dependents, over time from 1980 until the end of the century. That is China. That is the impact of the one-child policy in China. Look where it peaked. China peaked at 2.8 working age people to dependents. No wonder China grew so rapidly, because China's one-child policies forced it to peak at a tremendously high rate of working age people to dependents. The next growth country, where is the next surge going to come from? It's going to come from India. That is India. India is going to peak at about 2030, but look at the fact that India is going to peak at a much lower rate, about 2.2 working age people to dependents. Now, if we look at a country like Nigeria, this is Nigeria. So Nigeria peaks at its peak population in terms of working age to dependent around 2080. And it peaks at a much lower rate than even India. So you can already determine that firstly, India is going to not grow as rapidly as China. Secondly, that Nigeria is not going to grow as rapidly as India. And thirdly, you have to have a lot of belief that by the time all of this happens, manufacturing and agriculture is going to be able to absorb and provide jobs for people, for that mass of people. And we've done some work on that. So that was, I've explained the demographic dividend. I've explained the importance of the demographic dividend. I've already given you a hint that if we look, for example, at Nigeria's growth rate long term, it's not going to be able to grow rapidly enough, nor India possibly, but hopefully I've tried to explain why China and the Asian tigers, which I did not show, grew so rapidly. Let's look at the current path forecast. What do we expect? All things being equal, what is Africa's likely development trajectory? So here I show you millions of people on the left-hand side. So it goes from 0 to 2,500 or 2.5 billion people. And I show you extreme poverty on the right. And this is a forecast till 2050. So this is Africa's total population with extremely poor people in red and the rest of the population in blue. So at the moment, Africa has about 493 million people of its population of 1.3 billion that live in extreme poverty. By 2030, at the end of the Sustainable Development Goals, there will be about 486 million Africans living in extreme poverty. By 2050, about 272 million. So the rate, extreme poverty is coming down, but because of this massive population growth, it's not coming down very rapidly. If we look at what that means in terms of the percentage of Africa's population, it goes from about 37% at the moment to about 11%. In our view, it is very unlikely that Africa will come close to meeting the Sustainable Development Goal of eliminating extreme poverty by 2030. It's going to miss that. Because in actual fact, what is happening at the moment is that the numbers of extremely poor Africans are increasing rather than decreasing. So that's one. It's not a depressing picture, because if you look at Africa's rapid population growth, that against that rapid population growth, we can reduce poverty. It is really quite amazing. Let's look at Africa versus the rest of the world. On the left-hand side, it is, again, the ratio of working age people to elderly and dependents. At the bottom is a graph from 1980. This is until the end of the century. And this is, firstly, how Africa is expected to, when Africa is expected to achieve its peak demographic dividend. And you can see that's about 1972. And you can see also that the world achieved its peak demographic dividend in 2010. That is why we argue that globally the world is in a slow growth environment. Because globally, the size of the working age population relative to dependents is no longer increasing. It is now decreasing. So whereas until 2010 the whole world was in a pro-growth, rapid growth scenario, the whole world is in a lower growth scenario. There are two problems, of course, in this graph that you obviously see. The first is that Africa is going to peak lower than the global average. Very important, because that means our growth potential in Africa is lower than the growth potential was of the rest of the world when it peaked. And secondly, it's going to take us 54 years to get there. That doesn't mean that Africa doesn't grow for the next 54 years. Africa is growing because its working age population is growing the whole time. But we only really grow rapidly in that period. And we get there 54 years from now. So Africa really starts, growth in Africa really starts accelerating from about 2050 onward. But that is still, 2050 is still 22 years away from 2072, which is there. So let me now show you a demographic dividend scenario where we looked at what could be done about this. So we took the international futures forecasting system and we pulled various levers in it, making sure that every lever we pull is benchmarked against what would be reasonable progress. We firstly increased modern contraceptive use. There is in Africa a huge demand for contraceptive use. It's equivalent to about 2 children per woman that is unmet. If you simply meet that demand, you would already have a large impact on fertility rates. We did modest reductions in infant and female mortality rates from communicable diseases, which is a function of improvements in health systems in Africa. We steadily improved education outcomes in Africa. We eliminated the gender gap in education between boys and girls by 2030. And we improved the provision of safe water, sanitation and electricity within the international futures forecasting system, making sure that every intervention, every lever that we pull is a reasonable lever that speaks to progress that has been made in the past. Because obviously you can't be unreasonable. The impact of this is as follows. I'm showing you a graph that again has from 1980 at the bottom until 2100 and the ratio on the side. So this is Africa before the intervention and this is Africa after the intervention. And this is what I showed you previously with regard to the rest of the world. Same graph. Only line that's been added in this is this line. And you can clearly see that what we've done by those interventions is we bring the demographic dividend forward by 13 years. And secondly, Africa now peaks at 2.2 working age people versus dependents instead of 2. Has a huge impact on everything. What it has, the first thing it does, it reduces Africa's population by 837 million people. It's almost 1 billion people by the end of the century. So that's the most obvious impact it has. This is size of population over time from 2020 until the end of the century. But what is the impact on poverty? There's millions of people on the left, and this is again a forecast to 2050. This is the difference that it makes to poverty. So on the one side, you can see the demographic dividend scenario. Now, what is important about this graph is this shows millions of people. So despite the fact that Africa's population is much lower, the poverty rate comes down even more rapidly. In actual fact, despite the fact that by 2050, there are 250 million fewer people in Africa, poverty rate is there are 112 million less extremely poor people in Africa. That is amazing. That is truly amazing. What is the impact on income levels? This is the increase in income. This is all Africa's countries. This is the difference in income by 2050. So by 2050, the average annual incomes in a country like Angola has increased by $4,800 per person in 2050. So in 2050, the average Angolan will, in this scenario, get $4,800 per person more than he would have in the current path forecast. In Tanzania, $4,500. In Ghana, $2,300. In Egypt, $1,000. In Libya, $140. Libya is an upper middle income country like South Africa. So, I've shown you the difference that this makes in poverty. I've now shown you the difference that this makes on average income levels. This is what it does to the population itself. This is a population pyramid for Africa and the current path, and this is the demographic dividend scenario. The blue on the side indicates completed tertiary education, secondary, primary, and no education in the middle. Firstly, you can see that the shape has changed completely. It's now much more like the Taj Mahal. If you want a nice population structure, go for the Taj Mahal. Gives you a nice fat midriff, and you do well. Look at the increase in tertiary education. So this is by 2063. 2063 is the end of Agenda 2063 that the African Union has set as a vision for Africa. Average adult education, the gap between average adult education between Africa and the rest of the world narrows from 2.8 years to 2.4 years by 2063. Instead of that gap, remember I'm showing this growing gap between African averages and the averages in the rest of the world. In education, that gap narrows by from 2.8 to 2.4 years. So the summary impact is, firstly, by 2063, in the demographic dividend scenario, Africa would have 418 million fewer people, almost half a billion fewer people. Yet it would have a GDP that's $1.7 trillion larger than would be the case. And obviously, that means that individual Africans are significantly wealthier. Life expectancy is 1.2 years longer, and 178 million less Africans live in extreme poverty. It's a huge impact. There is a saying in the forecasting world that demographics is destiny. It is very true. Demographics accounts for populism, for democracy, for violence, to some extent. Doesn't explain all of that, but it's an incredibly powerful driver of the future. To conclude, and then to show you the video, globally we are in a slow growth environment, as I've tried to indicate, because globally population growth rates are slower, and the rate of the growth of the working age population to dependence is declining. But not in Africa. Africa is the only region where your working age is increasing and increasing rapidly. But it's going to take so long that we are going to peak relatively slowly. But average rates of economic growth in Africa is too slow, and population growth in rates too high to rapidly reduce poverty or improve average levels of income. What do we need to do? We need to speed up our demographic transition by accelerated rollout of modern contraceptives, female empowerment and education, because the deep driver is the relationship between men and women, improved health through clean water and improved sanitation, through candid and robust public discussions and scholarly analysis, through the provision of political leadership. That is why the statement by President Magufuli of Tanzania last week, when he said that Tanzania does not need contraception, that Tanzanians should have more children, stupid and foolish, is the best description of that statement.
Demographics are immensely important to economics. When the working age population, people between 15 and 64 years of age, is significantly larger than the dependent population, the very young and elderly, an economic window of opportunity known as the demographic dividend opens up. In fact, the relationship between the working age population and dependence is so important that it explains 1/3 to half of economic growth. And the higher the worker to dependent ratio, the faster the economic growth. Globally, the ratio of the world's working age population to dependence peaked in 2012 and will decline into the future, slowing global economic growth. Yet, in Africa, the size of the working age population as a portion of total population is still growing and will only peak shortly after 2070. That is because sub-Saharan Africa has a particularly young population. On current forecasts, Africa's peak worker-to-dependent ratio will, however, be low, which translates into relatively modest potential for rapid economic growth rates that will only accelerate mid-century or later. With few exceptions, average economic growth rates in Africa are too slow and population growth rates too high to allow the continent to either rapidly reduce poverty or improve average incomes. Targeted interventions on family planning, provision of clean water and improved sanitation, education, and advancing women's power, status, and education relative to those of men can dramatically improve human development outcomes by rapidly reducing poverty and increasing incomes. In a scenario that advances Africa's demographic dividend, the continent will, by 2063, have 418 million fewer people. Poverty will largely be eliminated, and Africa will have an economy that is 1.7 trillion US dollars larger than would otherwise be the case. Africans need to engage candidly and robustly in public discussions and scholarly analysis of the economic and developmental implications of the continent's large youthful population. Political leadership in discussing gender inequality and family size is vital, as are public media campaigns that demonstrate the health and economic benefits of smaller families. In addition to investing in the education of women and girls, African governments in low and lower middle income countries should prioritize the accelerated rollout of modern contraception. Such a program should first meet the pent-up demand for contraception and then aim to significantly expand contraception use beyond current planning. This would advance the onset and intensity of Africa's demographic dividend with substantive development benefits. Africa must take action to advance the achievement of its demographic dividend to rapidly alleviate poverty, grow incomes, and improve livelihoods.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Yaki. I am going to ask Gilbert to immediately provide us with his response. Thank you, Gilbert.
Thank you very much, Yaki, and for you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. As a political scientist, when I was reading the report, I thought a demographer would have actually been more critical of the richness of the paper. So I thought what I'll do just to raise a few comments about what I thought about the paper, and then we can launch into the discussion. I think the work around demography is important, and I like the paper because it conforms to the global targets of 2030. Where are we going? Where shall we be in 2030 with regard to demographics? But I also like the richness of the paper in contributing to our understanding of where Africa is actually going to be in 2063, because that's the platform that the AU has given us. So Yaki's work actually fits very well in giving us the kinds of insights of where we're going to be in 2063 and where we're going to be in 2030. And going through the demographic lens is actually a very interesting exercise. I also like the paper because it debunks, I think, what is really the conventional, what I want to call the conventional triumphalism about the problem of youth in Africa. I think we are celebrating too much about our youth. We are saying, you know, this is Africa is the the global future because we have a lot of young population and so on. So I think it does, in fact, raise bigger questions about what does a larger youth population actually mean, and in very concrete statistical terms. So the paper actually is bad news for most of us who are looking at the issues of demography and the issues around what is the link between demography and development. So I like, and we need to keep getting back to how do we get out of the bad news now that we know that we are not actually going to make that much progress in the next 50 years or so. Thirdly, I think what I liked about the paper is that it reminds us of the old debates in the 60s and 70s. The debates are about the critical role of fertility rates. The people like Emma Adelman, people like Arthur Lewis, writing in the 60s and 70s and saying, you know, demography is actually linked to development, and we have to be serious about these issues. So it is a reminder, therefore. You are taking us back to the 60s debates and the 70s debates that I think we forgot probably in the 80s and the 90s. And so I like that return to the old debate. So Yaki is actually telling us that, in fact, we are not going to make any traction on development. We are not going to do more if we don't look at the notion of the demographic transition. How can we actually get at a working age population that is lower, that is higher than the very young or the very old? I think that's what I got from that the description of the demographic transition. A very catchy phrase, and I like the way you describe it in the paper, using all the data that you have across our countries. Really struck by the fact that Niger only 15. The larger population is only under 15, and that's a very frightening figure if we think about it. I think, therefore, the story that comes up is that only 8 countries actually are going to, or are close to what Yaki is describing as a demographic transition or the dividend. Only 8 African countries are close. And so what happens to the rest? I think the figures are equally frightening. Only 27 countries are going to reach the demographic transition in 27 years. I think that's the figure. So in 36 years. And then some others, maybe 21, are going to do it in 18 years or so. So the picture is not as positive as it should be. But again, we can't run away from data if this data is accurate. And so we have to be honest that the figures don't look as good. But I think what I'm saying is that it jump-starts us into what needs to be done. And therefore, I also like the fact that the prescriptions that you go back to in getting into a demographic transition are actually the prescriptions of the 60s, the prescriptions of the 70s. Again, the literature telling us we need to pay attention to fertility rates, we need to pay attention to girls' education, we need to pay attention to gender equality. These are issues that were prescribed much, much earlier. And I like the fact that you could reiterate these very important issues if Africa is to overcome the kind of problems that it's going to face. Family planning, I think you do point it very clearly that we need to go back to those debates. My bigger question, however, is that since these prescriptions are very standard prescriptions, I thought the best way to understand the problems around the demographic transition is to ask why, if this is common knowledge, if this is standard knowledge, if this conventional wisdom that has been with us for many years, what explains the lack of movement on some of these issues? Because as you are saying that, I mean, if girls' education is important and if everybody's been investing in this, if there are international actors who are coalescing around these prescriptions that you put in the paper, what is preventing us, or what is preventing Niger, for instance, from in fact attaining those kinds of outcomes that you described? So I like the fact that you are putting the bigger picture to the table, but I want a bigger explanation as to why these countries actually is going to take them longer to get to what you're calling the ideal, even though your positive message is that things are getting better, and in maybe 2050 poverty rates, or 2063 Africa will be less poor. But I like a better explanation, as if this is the kind of problems that we economists, demographers have been talking about for all these years. Why haven't we made that much traction? You also have a discussion on the youth bulge, and I think I think you do mention that it's in another paper, and it would have been nice really to pick up on the issue of the youth bulge, the debates about the youth bulge, which have been clearly, I think, politicized in some cycles, to give an entirely negative picture about the youth bulge. I mean, I do understand that there is a lot of discussion around, youth and violence, youth and civil conflicts, but I think we need a better picture on the question around how do we actually use the youth in more creative ways. And I like an interesting discussion on how positive should we be, how positive can we be about the youth bulge, and where is that debate? How do we get to that debate? It's probably hiding in some of your figures, but I just want to get a sense because when we keep complaining about the youth bulge, it raises bigger issues about are we trying to run away from this problem, or are we complaining too much while we should be using the youth actually for the kinds of things you are describing. The other point about the demographic dividend is that I don't see how it is going to contribute. African countries are still very much agricultural economies. How is this demographic transition going to enhance agricultural production, for instance? There is a discussion around, industrialization, and we need to do more. We need to build more in the global networks and so on. But by 2063, these countries will still be very much agricultural economies. How does this dividend translate into that component of our economies? Because the alternative, as I said, in the Lewis model, is to say, get these people into industry, get them into productive industrial jobs. Is that actually going to happen? Or what is the scenario about the demographic dividend going to impact on what are going to be largely agricultural economies. Finally, there is an issue around migration, which is tied actually to the notion around the youth bulge or the demographic dividend. If the rest of the world does not, if the rest of the world has already attained the demographic dividend, and the bulk of them are in fact are going backwards, as you mentioned in the case of Japan, how can we have a debate around Africa's contribution globally to what is going to be that big deficit? And I want it to be couched in the sense around how can, in fact, migration, how can we shift the migration debates around Africa's contribution to a global labor deficit, if we could put it that way. And I thought maybe a paper that is looking at demographics in Africa, or the impending demographic dividend in 50 or 60 years, how can we put an argument that says Africa, therefore, will need to be contributing to the global glut in labor? And I know it's a very controversial argument, but I would have liked some space for it here as we look at Africa's future in terms of who is going to have more working age populations. If that is the argument, I think you put it very clearly. I think I'll just stop here, and those are my quick remarks on what I think is a very excellent report, and I think it will be read widely and contribute to the ongoing debates. And I like the fact that you mentioned Magufuli, because it struck me as quite an interesting statement from a leader in this day and age, where we know all the factors around population and the problems of population growth in our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gilbert. I think what you have done is to set the scene for us for a very interesting discussion now, by means of questions and answers and comments. And it is a pity that we at this point have to thank our online audience for having joined us. But I think this is where we now revert to a discussion just amongst this group. So my thanks to the outside people for having joined us, and I will give it a few seconds, I guess, and then we will go to a discussion here amongst the audience who are present.